Sometimes the people who hurt you the most are the ones who share your blood. Hal Brenner learned that lesson the hard way when his own siblings mocked him at their grandfather's funeral, laughing as he inherited nothing but a worthless $5 mountain shack. While they divided up the valuable parts of the estate, Hal was left with what nobody wanted. But Hal needed closure, so he drove up that lonely mountain road with his young daughter to see the old place one last time. Inside the dusty cabin, beneath the warped floorboards, he found a hidden trapdoor. It led to a sealed mine entrance, and below that lay a secret worth millions that had waited over a century to be discovered. What was hidden beneath that forgotten shack that would change everything? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The law office smelled of old leather and furniture polish, scents that reminded Hal Brenner of his grandfather's study. He sat in an uncomfortable chair, his daughter Annie beside him, her small hand tucked into his. Across the heavy oak desk, the attorney shuffled through papers with the practiced efficiency of someone who had delivered both good news and bad news countless times before. Hal's brother Kenneth sat to his right, checking his phone every few minutes. Designer suit, polished shoes, the kind of casual wealth that came from years of successful real estate development. To Hal's left, his sister Patricia crossed and uncrossed her legs, a lawyer's instincts already analyzing every word before it was spoken. Shall we begin? The attorney, a tired-looking man named Frederick Morrison, adjusted his reading glasses. Hal nodded. Annie squeezed his hand. She was 9 years old, wise beyond her years in the way children of divorce often are. She'd lost her grandfather 3 weeks ago, and Hal could see she was trying to be brave for him. The will was straightforward in its opening paragraphs. Small bequest to various charities. A few $1,000s to the housekeeper who had cared for grandfather in his final years. Then came the substantial assets. To my grandson Kenneth, I leave the lakeside property in Grand Lake, Colorado, including all structures and furnishings therein. Kenneth straightened slightly. Hal knew that property, a beautiful cabin worth at least $800,000. Maybe more. To my granddaughter Patricia, I leave my complete collection of antique mining equipment and historical artifacts, professionally appraised at $520,000. Patricia's expression didn't change, but Hal saw her shoulders relax. She'd gotten what she wanted. Frederick Morrison paused, glanced at Hal with something that might have been sympathy, and continued reading. To my grandson Harold, I leave the sum of $5, and the original mountain property located at Copper Ridge, coordinates to be provided separately. The silence lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then Kenneth laughed. Not a chuckle, but a full, genuine laugh that echoed off the paneled walls. $5? Kenneth shook his head. That's it? $5 and that old shack. Patricia wasn't laughing, but Hal could see the satisfaction in her eyes. The mountain property? Father, that place hasn't been occupied in decades. The structure is probably condemned by now. It's not even worth the property taxes, Kenneth added, still grinning. Well, I'm sorry, but that's pretty much an insult. Hal said nothing. He felt Annie's hand tighten in his, felt her looking up at him with worried eyes. He kept his face carefully neutral, the way he'd learned to do during his divorce. During the custody negotiations, during all the times when showing emotion would only make things worse. Frederick Morrison cleared his throat. There are specific instructions regarding the mountain property. The deceased requested that Harold visit the site before making any decisions about its disposition. Disposition? Kenneth laughed again. You mean before he tears it down for the lumber? That's about all it's good for. The attorney continued as if Kenneth hadn't spoken. The property includes approximately 40 acres of mountainous terrain. The structure itself is, as noted, quite old. However, your grandfather was very specific that Harold should examine it personally. Examine 40 acres of rocks and a rotting cabin, Patricia said. How thoughtful. Hal found his voice. It came out quieter than he'd intended. Grandfather loved that place. He used to take me there when I was young. He took all of us there, Kenneth said dismissively. Once. I remember it being cold, boring, and in the middle of nowhere. It meant something to him, Hal said. Patricia gathered her papers. Well, it's yours now. Congratulations on your $5 inheritance, Hal. Try not to spend it all in one place. She left first, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor. Kenneth followed, pausing at the door to glance back. Look, Hal, if you want help disposing of it, I know some guys who do land clearance. I can probably get you a few thousand for the scrap. Consider it a family favor. Then he was gone too, and Hal was alone with Annie and the attorney. Frederick Morrison set down the papers and removed his glasses. Your grandfather spoke very highly of you, Mr. Brenner. Not highly enough to leave me anything of value. Apparently, value is a complicated concept. The attorney opened a drawer and withdrew an envelope. He asked me to give you this. He said you'd understand when the time was right. Hal took the envelope. His name was written on it in his grandfather's careful handwriting. He started to open it, then stopped. Something made him want to wait, to be alone when he read whatever message waited inside. The property coordinates and deed are in this folder, Morrison continued, handing across a manila envelope. There are no liens, no outstanding taxes. It's fully paid and legally yours. A fully paid shack in the middle of nowhere, Hal said. That's something, I suppose. Annie tugged his sleeve. Can't we go see it, Daddy? Can we see Grandpa's mountain? Hal looked down at his daughter. She had her mother's eyes, but, he hoped, his own steadier temperament. The divorce had been hard on her. The past year a series of adjustments and compromises. Denise had primary custody, and Hal saw Annie on weekends and school breaks. Every moment felt precious and insufficient at the same time. You want to see an old cabin on a mountain? I want to see what Grandpa wanted you to have, Annie said simply. Out of the mouths of children, Hal thought. Wisdom that adults spent lifetimes trying to relearn. All right, he said. We'll go this weekend. Make an adventure of it. Frederick Morrison smiled for the first time. I think your grandfather would like that very much. That evening, alone in his small apartment after dropping Annie back with her mother, Hal finally opened the envelope Frederick had given him. Inside was a single piece of paper with his grandfather's handwriting, dated 2 weeks before his death. Harold, it read, by now you know what I've left you, and I imagine your brother and sister have made their opinions clear. Don't let their laughter wound you. They see the world through a lens of immediate value, of balance sheets and appraisals. You've always seen deeper. The mountain property is worth more than they can imagine, but not in the way they would measure worth. Go there. Look carefully. Remember the stories I told you. And remember that sometimes the things that appear worthless hold the greatest value. Trust yourself. Trust me. With love always, Grandpa Harold. Hal read it 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer of his knitstand. Next to the other item his grandfather had left him personally, a gold pocket watch, old and heavy, with an inscription on the back, to Harold, time reveals all truths. He picked up the watch now, felt its weight in his palm. The mechanism still ticked steadily, keeping perfect time after all these years. His grandfather had carried this watch every day of his adult life. Hal had seen it 1,000 times, checked against it when learning to tell time as a child, watched his grandfather wind it with careful, practiced movements. Time reveals all truths. What truth was waiting on that mountain? The drive took 3 hours, winding through increasingly remote terrain. Hal's truck climbed steady grades as civilization fell away behind them. Annie sat in the passenger seat, her homework forgotten in her lap as she watched the landscape, transformed from suburban sprawl to rural farmland to mountain wilderness. "How much further?" she asked. "According to the GPS, about 20 minutes. But we lost cell signal 15 minutes ago, so we're navigating by memory now." Hal remembered this road, though he'd only traveled it a handful of times as a child. His grandfather had brought him here maybe 5 or 6 summers during his youth. They'd camp for a few days, his grandfather telling stories about the old miners who'd worked these mountains, about the history hidden in the rocks and ravines. Kenneth had come once and complained about the bugs. Patricia had refused after that first trip, declaring it too primitive. But Hal had loved it, the silence, the stars at night, the sense of being removed from the world's noise and urgency. The turnoff appeared suddenly, barely visible. A narrow dirt road branching from the main highway, marked only by a faded wooden post that Hal would have missed if he hadn't been looking for it. He turned, and the truck bounced over ruts and rocks. "This is the road?" Annie asked, gripping the door handle. "This is it." Grandpa always said if you wanted something worth finding, it wouldn't be right next to the highway. They climbed for another 10 minutes, the road deteriorating with each passing yard. Finally, the trees opened into a small clearing, and there it was. The cabin looked worse than Hal remembered. Time and weather had not been kind. The wooden structure sagged on one side, and several roof shingles had blown away, leaving dark gaps like missing teeth. The porch had partially collapsed, and the windows were so dirty they were nearly opaque. Built directly against the cliff face, the cabin seemed to huddle in the mountain's shadow. Behind it, granite walls rose another 100 feet, creating a natural barrier that made the property feel enclosed, protected, or perhaps trapped. Hal parked and sat for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled. "It's smaller than I remember," he said finally. Annie unbuckled her seatbelt. "It's like something from a storybook." "Can we go inside?" They approached carefully, testing each board before putting weight on it. The front door hung crooked on its hinges, but opened with only minor resistance. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the musty smell of abandonment. One room, maybe 20 feet square. A cast-iron potbelly stove in the corner, cold and rusted. A simple wooden table with one remaining chair. Shelves along one wall, empty except for a few tin cups and plates. A narrow doorframe led to what might have once been a sleeping alcove, now empty. "This is what Uncle Kenneth and Aunt Patricia laughed about," Annie asked. "This is it." Annie walked slowly around the space, her footsteps leaving prints in the dust. "But Grandpa loved it here." "He did. Then it must be special somehow." Hal smiled despite himself. "You sound very sure about that." Grandpa was smart. He wouldn't love something that was just old and broken. Annie stopped by the window, wiping a circle in the grime with her sleeve. He saw something here that other people didn't see. While Annie explored, Hal began a more systematic examination. He told himself this trip was about closure, about honoring his grandfather's request to visit. But standing here now, remembering the note, look carefully. He found himself searching for something without knowing what. The walls were solid, the timber aged but not rotted. The stove, though rusted, was well made, probably worth something to an antique collector. The shelves held nothing of interest. He was about to give up when Annie called from the alcove. "Daddy, come look at this." She was kneeling in the corner, pointing at something on the floor. Hal joined her and saw what had caught her attention. A small metal tin, the kind that might have held tobacco or tea. It was wedged between 2 floorboards, barely visible. Hal worked it free. Inside were photographs, protected from moisture by a layer of wax paper. He lifted them carefully. The first showed his grandfather as a young man, maybe 30 years old, standing with a group of other men in front of this very cabin. All wore work clothes and hard hats. Miners, Hal realized. Or prospectors. The second photograph showed his grandfather alone, older, standing in the same spot but decades later. He was smiling, holding something in his hands, but the image was too faded to make out what. The third photograph made Hal's breath catch. It showed a young boy himself standing next to his grandfather right here in this cabin. Hal couldn't have been more than 10. He remembered that visit, though he'd forgotten this photograph existed. His grandfather had his arm around Hal's shoulders, and both were smiling at the camera. "That's you," Annie said with delight. "That's me." Hal studied the image. What had they done that day? He searched his memory. They'd explored. He remembered that. His grandfather had shown him the mountain, taught him about minerals and geology. Had they found something? Discovered something? The memory wouldn't quite surface. Annie had moved away, was examining the floorboards where the tin had been hidden. "Daddy, this board is loose." Hal set down the photographs and joined her. She was right. One of the boards moved when she pressed on it. He worked his fingers into the gap and pulled. The board came up easily, as if it had been removed and replaced many times. Beneath it was darkness. Hal pulled out his phone, turned on the flashlight. The beam revealed more boards below, but these ran perpendicular to the floor above. He removed 2 more boards, widening the opening. Not a crawl space, not a foundation, a trapdoor. Set flush with the subfloor was a wooden hatch, maybe 3 feet square, with an iron ring handle. And next to the ring, built into the wood itself, was a combination lock, old, weathered, but still functional. Hal sat back on his heels, heart suddenly pounding. "What is it?" Annie whispered. "I don't know." But that wasn't quite true. He knew what it was. A hidden entrance. A secret his grandfather had kept. The question was, an entrance to what? He tried the lock. It didn't budge. 3 rotating dials, numbers 0 through 9. 1,000 possible combinations. "Do you know the code?" Annie asked. Hal shook his head, then stopped, looked at his daughter. "Wait, hand me my jacket." She brought it, and he pulled out his grandfather's pocket watch from the inner pocket. He'd brought it without really knowing why, some instinct that told him to keep it close on this trip. He turned it over, read the inscription again. "To Harold, time reveals all truths." Below that was a date, engraved in smaller numbers. August 17th, 55. 8/17/55. His grandfather's birthday? No, that was in March. An anniversary? The date he'd bought this property? Hal set the dials. 817. Held his breath. Pulled. Nothing. He tried. Again. 175. Still nothing. Annie leaned close. "What about all the numbers? 81755? Too many numbers. Only 3 dials." Then it hit him. Not the full date. Just the year. He set the dials. 555. The lock clicked open. Hal lifted the trapdoor slowly, hinges groaning from decades of disuse. Cool air rushed up from below, carrying the mineral smell of deep earth and stone. His phone's flashlight beam cut into darkness, revealing wooden ladder rungs descending into shadow. "Can we go down?" Annie's voice held equal parts excitement and nervousness. "Not yet. We need proper equipment. Flashlights, rope, safety gear." Hal played the light along the shaft. The ladder looked solid enough, but he could only see the first dozen rungs. Beyond that, darkness swallowed everything. But what if someone comes and closes it? No one's coming. This place hasn't been visited in years. Grandpa visited, Annie pointed out. She was right, of course. His grandfather had been here, had opened this trapdoor, had descended into whatever lay below. The realization sent a strange mixture of emotions through Hal: wonder at his grandfather's secret life, sadness that he'd never shared it, and growing curiosity about what had been important enough to hide. "We'll come back tomorrow," Hal decided. First thing in the morning, properly prepared. They secured the cabin as best they could and drove down the mountain toward Copperfield, the nearest town. Hal remembered it as barely more than a crossroads, and time hadn't changed that assessment. Population maybe 400, most of them retirement age. The kind of place young people left and old people came to for the quiet. The general store occupied the ground floor of a 2-story building on what passed for Main Street. A bell chimed as they entered, and an older man looked up from behind the counter. He was perhaps 75, with white hair and a weathered face that spoke of decades in mountain sun. "Help you folks?" "We need some supplies," Hal said. "Flashlights, rope, basic camping gear. Camping up in the mountains?" The man moved from behind the counter with surprising agility. "Getting late in the season for it. Weather can turn quick up there. Just for a day or two. Nothing extensive." The man studied Hal with the frank assessment of someone who'd lived long enough not to waste time on social niceties. "You're not from around here." "No, but my grandfather had property nearby. We're just visiting it." "Property nearby?" The man's expression shifted. "What was your grandfather's name?" "Harold Brenner." Recognition lit the old man's eyes. "Harold Brenner. Well, I'll be." "You're his grandson?" "I am." "I'm Hal. This is my daughter Annie." The man extended his hand. "Clarence Boone. I run this place. Known your grandfather 30 years, maybe more. Heard he passed. I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you." Clarence gathered the supplies Hal requested: 2 heavy-duty flashlights, a coil of climbing rope, batteries, a first aid kit. As he rang up the purchase, he said, "Your grandfather used to come through here regular. Every few months, he'd stop in, buy supplies, head up to that mountain property of his." "Did he say what he was doing up there?" "Nope, and I didn't ask. Man's entitled to his privacy." Clarence bagged the items. "But I always figured he was doing something more than just camping. He'd buy specific things, surveying equipment, rock hammers, that kind of gear. Not what you take for a recreational visit." Hal absorbed this. "Did anyone else ever go up there with him?" "Not that I saw. He always came alone. Sometimes he'd stay up there for weeks at a stretch." Clarence leaned on the counter. "You planning to do something with the property? Sell it?" "I haven't decided yet." "Well, if you need anything while you're here, I'm around." Stores open 7 days. Then, as Hal was turning to leave, Clarence added, "Your grandfather was a good man. Honest. Whatever he was doing up there, I'm sure he had his reasons." They found a small motel on the edge of town, 6 rooms, all available, and settled in for the night. After Annie fell asleep in one of the twin beds, Hal sat by the window and examined his grandfather's pocket watch again by lamplight. Time reveals all truths. What truth was hidden in that shaft beneath the cabin? He pulled out the photographs they'd found in the tin, studied them more carefully now. In the image of his grandfather with the mining crew, he noticed details he'd missed before. The men looked serious, purposeful. This wasn't a casual gathering. And behind them, barely visible in the photograph's background, was the cabin door standing open, revealing darkness inside. Had the trapdoor existed even then? Had his grandfather found it or built it? The photograph of young Hal with his grandfather held his attention longest. He remembered that day now, or pieces of it. His grandfather teaching him about different types of rock formations, showing him how to identify minerals. But more than the lessons, Hal remembered the feeling being seen, being valued, being trusted with knowledge his grandfather considered important. His siblings had never had that connection. Kenneth and Patricia had visited once, complained about the isolation, and never returned. But Hal had come back summer after summer until he was 15 or 16, until teenage life pulled him in other directions. When had he stopped visiting? He couldn't quite remember. Gradually, he supposed. The way children drift from childhood places and childhood relationships. And his grandfather had never pushed, never demanded. Just continued his solitary trips to the mountain, keeping whatever secrets lay beneath that cabin floor. Hal's phone buzzed a text from his ex-wife Denise, received earlier when they'd still had signal, just now coming through. Hope you and Annie are having a good time. She seemed excited about the trip. Don't keep her out too late Sunday school Monday. Another text followed. Kenneth called me. Wanted to know if you were okay. Said you'd inherited something insulting from your grandfather. Are you all right? Hal typed back. We're fine. The inheritance is complicated, but meaningful. Kenneth wouldn't understand. He didn't expect a response. She probably didn't have signal, either by now, but one came through. You always saw things differently than your siblings. It's one of the things I loved about you. Loved. Past tense. Their marriage had ended. 2 years ago, not in explosive conflict, but in gradual realization that they wanted different things from life. She'd wanted security, predictability, advancement. He'd wanted meaning, purpose, connection. Neither was wrong, but they were incompatible. The divorce had been civil, the custody arrangement fair. They'd managed to preserve respect if not love. But Hal still felt the failure of it, the awareness that he'd somehow let down both Denise and Annie. Maybe that's why his grandfather's faith in him mattered so much. Someone believing he was capable of understanding something important, of being trusted with something valuable. After a year of feeling like he'd failed at the most important commitment of his life, that trust was water in a desert. He set the phone aside and returned to the window. Outside, Copperfield was dark, except for a few streetlights. Stars blazed overhead in the way they only did far from cities. His grandfather had taught him constellations on this mountain, pointing out patterns and telling the old stories behind their names. What story was his grandfather trying to tell now? Tomorrow, Hal thought. Tomorrow we'll find out. He checked on Annie one more time, sleeping soundly, her small face peaceful in the lamplight, then settled into his own bed. Sleep came slowly, his mind churning with possibilities and questions. Somewhere in the darkness, an old cabin held secrets, and tomorrow he would descend into them. Morning came cold and clear. Hal and Annie ate breakfast at the motel's small dining area, coffee and cereal. Nothing fancy, then drove back up the mountain as soon as the sun cleared the eastern peaks. The cabin looked different in daylight, less menacing and more melancholy. Just an old structure slowly surrendering to time and weather. But Hal knew now that appearances were deceiving, that beneath the weathered exterior lay something his grandfather had considered worth protecting. They entered carefully, and Hal removed the floorboards again, exposing the trapdoor. In daylight filtering through the dirty windows, he could see more detail. The wood of the hatch was different from the floor, newer, better maintained. His grandfather had built this, or at least rebuilt it, in the past few decades. Ready? Hal asked Annie. She nodded, though he could see nervousness in her eyes. You stay up here while I check it out. If anything seems wrong, I'll come right back up. Be careful, Daddy. Hal clipped one of the flashlights to his belt, held the other in his hand, and tested the first ladder rung. It held his weight. The second, the same. He descended slowly, checking each rung before committing his full weight. The shaft went down 30 feet, the ladder secured to the rock wall with iron brackets. At the bottom, his feet touched a solid stone. He swept the flashlight beam around and felt his breath catch. He was standing in a tunnel hand carved from the mountain's granite, maybe 7 feet high and 5 feet wide. Timber beams supported the ceiling at regular intervals, and the floor was worn smooth from years, perhaps decades, of foot traffic. This wasn't a natural cave. This was a mine. Daddy? Are you okay? Annie's voice echoed down the shaft. I'm fine. It's a tunnel. I'm going to look around a bit. Don't go too far. I won't. Hal followed the tunnel. It ran straight for perhaps 50 yards, then opened into a larger chamber. Here, the mining work was more evident, tool marks on the walls, places where ore had been extracted, and against one wall, several wooden crates stacked carefully. He approached the crates cautiously. They were old, the wood weathered but still intact. He opened the nearest one and found rocks, not just any rocks, but ore samples. Chunks of stone shot through with gleaming mineral veins. The next crate held tools. Mining equipment, mostly hand tools, antiques by the look of them. Pickaxes, chisels, hammers, all showed signs of age and use. The third crate was different. Smaller, more carefully constructed. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a leather-bound book. Hal lifted it carefully. The leather was cracked with age, but still intact. He opened it to the first page and read in faded ink, Journal of Ezekiel Thorne, March 1897, a prospector's journal. Hal's hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages. The entries were detailed, describing Ezekiel's arrival in Colorado, his search for silver, his eventual discovery of this site. The writing was careful, educated, not what Hal would have expected from the rough frontier prospector stereotype. May 15th, 1897. Have staked my claim today. The vein runs deep, richer than anything I dared hope for. But the mountain holds more than silver. There are signs of earlier inhabitants, the native peoples who knew this land long before men like me came seeking fortune. Hal flipped through more pages, scanning entries about mining techniques, ore quality, occasional visits to town for supplies. Then, about halfway through the journal, the tone changed. August 3rd, 1899. They're watching. I'm certain of it now. Carson's men, or maybe the syndicate from Denver. Someone knows about the strike. Must be more careful. The entries became shorter, more paranoid. August 19th, 1899. Moved the good samples deeper into the system. 3 pages torn from journal in case it falls into wrong hands. 3 pages torn. Hal checked. Sure enough, ragged edges showed where pages had been removed. The final entries were cryptic. September 2nd, 1899. Hidden it where only blood will find it. The mountain keeps its promises. September 10th, 1899. If I'm found, let it be known I broke no laws and harmed no man. The wealth of the earth belongs to those with courage to seek it and wisdom to protect it. After that, blank pages. Had Ezekiel died? Disappeared? The journal offered no answers. But Hal noticed something else. Tucked into the back of the journal was a hand-drawn map, not of the surface, but of the tunnel system. The chamber where Hal stood was marked clearly, but the map showed 3 additional passages, branching off passages Hal hadn't yet explored. He folded the map carefully and tucked it into his jacket pocket. Then he gathered the journal and a few of the ore samples and made his way back to the ladder. Annie's relieved face appeared above as he climbed. You were gone forever. 10 minutes, maybe 15. But I found something important. Up in the cabin, Hal showed her the journal. Annie handled it with the reverence of a child who'd been taught to respect old things. Who was Ezekiel Thorne? A prospector. A miner. He found this place over 100 years ago. And Grandpa found his journal? Apparently. Hal opened the map. Look at this. There are more tunnels. Ezekiel mapped out a whole system down there. Annie traced the lines with her finger. What's in the other tunnels? That's what we need to find out. But not today, Hal decided. They needed more time, more preparation. And he needed to understand what he was dealing with. The historical mine was one thing. A mine that might still contain valuable ore was something else entirely. They spent the rest of the morning examining the cabin more thoroughly. Behind a loose board in the alcove, Hal found more evidence of his grandfather's visits, battery-powered lanterns, a newer survey map with notations in his grandfather's handwriting, and a small notebook. The notebook was recent, dated from the past 5 years. His grandfather's handwriting, now shakier than in earlier years, documented his explorations of the mine system. East Tunnel partially collapsed, unsafe for deep exploration. West Tunnel shows evidence of water intrusion, possible underground spring. Main tunnel extends at least 200 yards. Vein continues. Quality samples extracted and stored. So his grandfather had been actively working this mine, at least in a limited capacity, right up until his final years. The implications were staggering. Hal photographed every page of both journals, the map, and all his findings. If something happened, if the cabin burned or collapsed, at least he'd have a record. As they prepared to leave that evening, Annie asked, "Are you going to tell Uncle Kenneth and Aunt Patricia?" Hal considered. "Not yet. Not until I understand what this is. They'll be mad if they find out. They're already mad. This won't change that." But even as he said it, Hal knew the situation was more complicated. If this mine contained significant mineral deposits, his siblings would fight for a share. The will had been clear, but Kenneth had money for lawyers, and Patricia was a lawyer. They could tie things up in court for years. No, better to understand the full scope before saying anything. Better to know exactly what his grandfather had left him before the family war began. Hal spent the next week researching. He dropped Annie back with Denise and returned to his life teaching American history to high school students who mostly cared more about their phones than the past. But between classes, during lunch breaks, in the evenings after grading papers, he dove into everything he could find about historical mining, mineral rights, and silver prospecting in Colorado. The more he learned, the more extraordinary his grandfather's secret became. Wire silver, the term kept appearing in his research. Rare, valuable, formed under specific geological conditions. Collectors paid premium prices for quality specimens. Museums featured them in permanent collections. And if Ezekiel's journal was accurate, that's what the mine contained. Hal needed expert verification, but he was wary of trust. One careless word to the wrong person, and his grandfather's carefully guarded secret would become public knowledge. Kenneth would find out. Legal complications would follow. After careful consideration, Hal reached out to a retired geologist he'd found through his research, Dr. Vernon Ashby, who'd published extensively on Colorado mineral deposits and now lived in Denver. The man's credentials were impeccable, and more importantly, at 74 years old, he seemed unlikely to be motivated by financial gain. Their phone conversation was brief. "Dr. Ashby, my name is Hal Brenner. I've inherited some property that may contain mineral deposits. I'd like to have samples analyzed, but I need discretion." A pause. "What kind of minerals are we talking about?" "Possibly silver. Wire silver, based on visual examination." Another pause. Longer this time. "Wire silver is quite rare, Mr. Brenner. If you've actually found it, that's significant. I'd need to see samples. Could you come to Denver?" "I'd rather not send them through the mail." "I could do that. Are you comfortable bringing them to my home?" "I have a full lab set up in my basement. Old habit from my teaching days." They arranged a meeting for the following Saturday. Hal made the 5-hour drive with several ore samples carefully wrapped in his backpack, the journal photographs on his laptop, and a growing sense that his life was about to change dramatically. Vernon Ashby lived in a modest house in a quiet Denver neighborhood. He answered the door himself, a tall man, slightly stooped, with wild white hair and penetrating blue eyes behind thick glasses. "Mr. Brenner?" "Dr. Ashby. Thank you for seeing me." "Call me Vernon." Come in. The basement lab was impressive: microscopes, testing equipment, shelves of rock samples, and walls covered with geological maps. Vernon handled the ore samples with the delicate touch of someone who'd spent a lifetime studying such things. "May I?" he asked, indicating a microscope. "Of course." Vernon prepared a sample, examined it for several minutes in silence. Then he sat back, removed his glasses, and cleaned them thoughtfully. "Mr. Brenner, where exactly did you find this?" "On property I inherited, in the mountains west of Copperfield." "And you have legal ownership of the mineral rights?" "According to the deed, yes." Vernon nodded slowly. This is museum-quality wire silver. The formation is exceptional. The purity is remarkable. He paused. Do you understand what you have here? I'm beginning to. Conservative estimate, just for the samples you've brought me, we're talking about $3 to $5 million. Possibly more, depending on documentation and provenance. Collectors pay extraordinary prices for specimens like this. Hal felt the room tilt slightly. He'd known it was valuable, but hearing an actual number made it real in a way nothing else had. Vernon continued, but that's just the samples. If there's a vein, an actual silver vein producing this quality, we could be talking about $15 to $20 million. Maybe more. That seems impossible. It's rare, but not impossible. Colorado has a history of surprise discoveries. And if this site has been unknown for over a century, it's been protected from the kind of exploitation that depletes most deposits. Vernon studied Hal carefully. Why are you being so secretive about this? Hal explained the inheritance, his siblings' dismissal, the need to understand what he was dealing with before family complications arose. Vernon listened without interruption. When Hal finished, the old geologist smiled. Your grandfather sounds like a wise man, and you sound like someone trying to honor that wisdom. He set down the sample. I'd like to visit the site, do a proper assessment. But I want to be clear about something. I'm 74 years old. I have more money than I need, and more years behind me than ahead. I'm not interested in exploiting your discovery. I'd just love to see a genuine find one more time. Would that be acceptable? Something in Vernon's directness resonated with Hal. That would be very acceptable. Thank you. They arranged for Vernon to drive up the following weekend. As Hal was preparing to leave, Vernon said, one more thing. Guard this information carefully. Once word gets out, you'll face claim jumpers, legal challenges, environmental concerns, and every kind of complication imaginable. Your grandfather kept this quiet for good reason. Driving home, Hal's phone rang. Kenneth. He considered not answering, then decided avoidance would only make things worse. Kenneth. Hal. Finally. I've been trying to reach you all week. I've been busy. Teaching, you know. That's what pays my bills. Right. Listen. Patricia and I have been thinking. This inheritance situation isn't fair. Grandfather clearly wasn't thinking straight when he made that will. The will was legally executed. His attorney confirmed he was completely competent. Legally, sure. But morally? Come on, Hal. You got essentially nothing while we got everything of value. We want to make it right. Make it right how? We're prepared to offer you $50,000. Cash, for your share of the estate. Hal nearly laughed. $50,000. They thought they were being generous. Kenneth, I don't need your money. The will stands as written. Don't be stubborn about this. That mountain property is worthless. Everyone knows it. We're trying to help you. I don't recall either of you being interested in helping me during the divorce, or when I was looking for a place to live, or any other time I actually needed family support. Silence on the line. Then Kenneth's voice, harder now. Is this about the property? Did you find something up there? I found an old cabin that meant something to Grandfather. That's enough. You're lying. Patricia thinks so too. We hired someone to check it out. Hal's grip tightened on the steering wheel. You did what? A private investigator. To document the property condition. For legal purposes. You sent someone onto my property without permission? That's trespassing, Kenneth. Our lawyer says if you found anything of value, we have grounds to contest the will. Undue influence. Mental incapacity. We can tie this up in court for years, Hal. Or you can be reasonable and work with us. I'm done with this conversation. Don't make this difficult. We're family. Family doesn't laugh at your inheritance. Family doesn't threaten lawsuits. Family doesn't send investigators to spy on you. Hal pulled into his apartment complex parking lot. The property is mine, Kenneth. Legally and morally. If you want to waste money on lawyers, that's your choice. He ended the call before Kenneth could respond. Inside his apartment, Hal sat in the darkness for a long time. His siblings weren't going to let this go. They sensed something, even if they didn't know what. And once they discovered the truth, once they learned about the mine and its value, the battle would become much worse. He needed to act quickly, secure his legal position, document everything, and most importantly, understand exactly what his grandfather had left him and why. His phone buzzed with a text from Patricia. Kenneth told me about your call. You're making a mistake. Last chance to settle this reasonably. Hal didn't respond. Instead, he opened his laptop and began drafting an email to Graham Whitfield, a property attorney in Copperfield, whose name Clarence had mentioned. If his siblings wanted a legal fight, he needed to be prepared. The inheritance had started as a puzzle and a connection to his grandfather. Now it was becoming something else entirely, a test of his ability to protect what had been entrusted to him, regardless of the cost. Vernon Ashby arrived the following Saturday in a battered pickup truck loaded with professional equipment. Hal met him at the cabin, relieved to see a friendly face after a week of increasing tension with his siblings. Quite a location, Vernon said, surveying the property. Remote enough to keep secrets. That seems to have been the point. They descended into the mine together, Vernon moving with surprising agility for his age. In the main chamber, surrounded by Ezekiel's crates and tools, Vernon set up his equipment and began a systematic survey. Ground-penetrating radar, mineral testing equipment, structural analysis tools. Vernon worked with the methodical patience of someone who'd spent a lifetime turning uncertainty into data. The timber supports are solid, he said, examining the beams. Properly installed. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. Ezekiel Thorne, the original prospector. And your grandfather maintained them. Vernon pointed to several beams that showed signs of replacement. See these? Modern lumber, probably replaced within the last decade. Your grandfather wasn't just exploring, he was actively preserving the site. Over the next 2 days, Vernon completed his assessment. The results were staggering. The silver vein wasn't just a pocket. It ran deep into the mountain, extending at least 400 feet beyond what had been explored. The ore quality remained consistent throughout, and the formation itself was rare enough to be of interest not just to collectors, but to geological researchers. This is one of the last significant undiscovered silver deposits in Colorado, Vernon said, reviewing his data. Maybe in the entire Rocky Mountain region. Your grandfather must have known, must have spent years documenting it. But he never mined it, never exploited it. Smart man. The moment word got out, he'd have faced legal challenges, environmental reviews, corporate buyout attempts, and every kind of complication imaginable. Vernon looked at Hal seriously. That's what you're facing now. The question is what you want to do with it. What are my options? Sell to a mining company. They'd pay well, but they'd strip it. Sell to a museum, less money, but it preserves the historical and scientific value. Mine it yourself, though that requires capital and expertise you probably don't have. Or seal it up and leave it alone. Hal considered. What would you do? I'm a scientist. I'd want it preserved, studied, shared with people who could learn from it. Vernon packed his equipment. But I'm not the one who inherited it. That's your decision. Before Vernon could leave, they heard vehicle doors slamming outside. Hal climbed up first and found Kenneth and Patricia standing by the cabin, along with a third person, a younger man with a camera. What are you doing here? Hal demanded. Our property, too, Patricia said coolly. We have as much right to be here as you do. Actually, you don't. The will was clear. Kenneth gestured to the younger man. This is our surveyor. We're documenting the property condition for our legal case." Vernon emerged from the cabin, and Kenneth's eyes narrowed. "Who are you?" "A friend," Vernon said calmly. "Friends don't bring professional equipment to old cabins." Kenneth looked at Hal. "What's going on here? What did you find?" "Nothing that concerns you." Patricia stepped forward. "Hal, we know you found something." The investigator saw lights in the mine, equipment, activity. "Whatever it is, we have a legal right to share in it." "You have no rights here. This property is mine." "We'll contest that," Patricia said. "On grounds of undue influence and grandfather's diminished mental capacity at the time he made the will. He was completely competent. His attorney will testify to that." "Attorneys can be convinced to say many things," Patricia replied. "We have witnesses who'll testify to his confusion in his final months. We have medical experts who'll question his judgment." Hal felt anger rising but kept his voice level. "You're going to lie in court? Manufacture evidence? That's your plan?" Kenneth had the grace to look uncomfortable, but Patricia met Hal's gaze steadily. "We're going to ensure fair distribution of family assets. If you'd been reasonable about this, it wouldn't be necessary." "Reasonable? You laughed at my inheritance, called it an insult. Now you want to steal it because you think there's value here?" "We're family," Kenneth said. "This should be divided equally." "Family," Hal repeated. "When did you last act like family, Kenneth?" "When you skipped Annie's birthday party because you had a golf game. When you didn't call once during my divorce. When you forgot to visit grandfather for 6 months before he died." Kenneth flushed. "That's not fair." "No. What's not fair is you trying to take something grandfather specifically wanted me to have. Something he protected for decades, waiting for the right person to inherit it." "The right person?" Patricia's voice dripped with scorn. "You're a high school teacher making $40,000 a year. Kenneth builds developments worth millions. I negotiate contracts for Fortune 500 companies. But somehow you're the right person to inherit valuable property." "Yes," Vernon said quietly. Everyone turned to look at him, because he understands that some things matter more than their monetary value. Your grandfather knew that. Apparently, Mr. Brenner does too. Patricia ignored Vernon, focused on Hal. "We're filing the lawsuit Monday. Your choice how expensive this gets. Work with us now, or we'll drag this through courts for years. We can afford it. Can you?" She was right, and they all knew it. Hal couldn't afford a prolonged legal battle. His teacher's salary barely covered rent and child support. 1 year of lawyer fees would bankrupt him. But something in his grandfather's letter echoed in his mind. "Trust yourself." "File your lawsuit," Hal said. "I'll see you in court." Patricia and Kenneth exchanged glances. The surveyor lowered his camera. They'd expected him to cave, to negotiate, to be reasonable. "This is a mistake," Kenneth said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe, but it's my mistake to make." After they left, Vernon put a hand on Hal's shoulder. "That took courage. But they weren't bluffing about the lawsuit. I know. You need a good lawyer, and you need to establish your legal position before they can undermine it." Vernon was right. Hal called Graham Whitfield that evening, the attorney Clarence had recommended. Graham agreed to meet first thing Monday morning. But Vernon's assessment provided something else: documentation. Official geological surveys, professional opinions, evidence that the property was exactly what the will stated. Hal's inheritance, protected by law. That night, alone in the cabin, Hal found something he'd missed before. Behind a false panel in the cabin's wall was a metal strongbox. Inside were more of his grandfather's notes, and something else, a letter sealed with Hal's name on it. The handwriting was shaky, the envelope worn. Dated 3 months before his grandfather's death. Hal held it for a long moment before opening it. Whatever was inside would answer questions, but might raise new ones. Finally, he broke the seal and began to read. Dear Harold, the letter began in his grandfather's careful script. If you're reading this, you found what I left for you. More importantly, you found the truth. Hal sat on the cabin floor, back against the wall, and continued reading. There are things about our family you never knew. Things I kept hidden, not from shame, but from necessity. The time has come for you to understand everything. Ezekiel Thorne was not just a prospector who happened to own this land. He was my great-grandfather. Your great-great-grandfather. I know this comes as a shock. I never spoke of it because the connection was deliberately obscured. Ezekiel had a daughter born in 1895, before he came to Colorado. Her name was Martha. She was my grandmother, though I barely knew her. She died when I was 12, but before she passed, she told me a story. Ezekiel didn't die in the winter storm of 1903, as the newspapers reported. He faked his death. He'd struck real silver, the kind men kill for, and within weeks, dangerous people knew about it. Claim jumpers, criminal syndicates, men who wouldn't hesitate to murder for what lay beneath this mountain. So Ezekiel disappeared. He abandoned his identity, moved east, and lived under an assumed name for another 15 years. But before he vanished, he wrote everything down: the location, the maps, the truth, and sent it to his daughter in a series of coded letters. Martha kept those letters hidden. She passed them to her daughter, my mother, with instructions to reveal them only to someone who could be trusted, someone who would understand their significance beyond mere wealth. My mother gave them to me in 1954 on her deathbed. I was 24 years old, just back from Korea, trying to figure out what to do with my life. She said, "Your great-grandfather left you a legacy, but it comes with responsibility. Promise me you'll protect it until you find someone worthy of carrying it forward." I made that promise, and I've spent the last 67 years keeping it. Hal paused, absorbing this revelation. His grandfather had known about the mine for nearly 7 decades, had protected it, preserved it, waited for the right moment to pass it on. The letter continued. Now I must tell you something harder. Kenneth and Patricia are your half-siblings, not full siblings. Their mother, my first wife, Eleanor, left me when they were very young. Kenneth was 2, Patricia just an infant. Eleanor couldn't handle the isolation of mountain life, the simplicity of a working man's existence. She wanted status, wealth, comfort. We divorced, and she remarried quickly, a businessman in Chicago. Kenneth and Patricia grew up in that world. When they came back into my life as teenagers, they were already formed by their mother's values. I tried to love them, tried to bridge the gap, but the differences were profound. Your father, my son with my second wife, Charlotte, was different. And you, Harold, you inherited something neither Kenneth nor Patricia ever had: the ability to see value beyond price tags. Hal's hands trembled slightly. He'd never known any of this: the divorce, the different mothers, the hidden family history. It explained so much about the dynamics he'd observed but never understood. But there's more you need to know, the letter went on. The mine isn't just about silver. Ezekiel discovered something else, something that makes this site historically significant beyond its mineral value. The tunnels were already there when Ezekiel arrived. Not all of them. He carved many himself, but the deepest chambers were ancient. Indigenous peoples used these caves for centuries, perhaps millennia, before European settlers arrived. Ezekiel documented what he found: pottery fragments, tools, ceremonial objects. He was educated enough to recognize their significance. And he was honorable enough to feel guilty about mining in what he came to understand was a sacred space. His journal entries from August 1899, the pages he tore out, describe his meetings with a Ute elder. The elder showed him respect, taught him about the mountain's spiritual significance, and asked him to protect what remained. Ezekiel made a vow. If he profited from the silver, he would preserve the sacred chambers and ensure that any artifacts were eventually returned to the indigenous people who created them. Those torn pages are hidden in the archive room behind the false wall in the deepest chamber. They'll explain everything Ezekiel never wanted outsiders to find. Hal set down the letter for a moment, his mind reeling. An archive room? He hadn't discovered that yet. And indigenous artifacts? This changed everything. He picked up the letter again. I've spent decades researching this. I've documented every artifact, photographed everything, and 7 years ago, I contacted the Ute Mountain Ute Tribal Council. We've been negotiating an agreement. They receive the artifacts and control over the ceremonial chambers, while you retain mineral rights to the commercial deposits. The agreement was nearly finalized when my health began failing. It remains unsigned. But the tribal council knows about it, and they're waiting for someone to honor my commitment. This is why I left the property to you, Harold. Kenneth would sell everything to the highest bidder. Patricia would lawyer it into an intellectual property maze. But you'll do the right thing, even if it costs you. The letter's tone shifted, becoming more personal. I know what your siblings will say about this inheritance. I know they'll feel cheated, will claim I was senile or manipulated. They see the world through a lens of transactions and equivalent exchanges. They can't understand that some inheritances aren't about fairness. They're about fitness. You're fit for this responsibility, Harold. Not because you're smarter or better than your siblings, but because you understand that some promises transcend generations, that some debts must be paid, even to people who died long before we were born. The money from the mine will help you and Annie. You deserve financial security after the struggles you've endured. But more important than the money is the choice you'll make about how to use it. Will you honor Ezekiel's promise? Will you return what belongs to the Ute people? Will you preserve this site's historical significance, even if it means accepting less profit? I already know your answer. That's why I trusted you with this. There's a document in the strongbox, the draft agreement with the tribal council. Contact the Lawrence Whitehorse at the Cultural Preservation Office. He's expecting someone from our family to reach out. He's a good man, Harold. He'll help you navigate this honorably. Your grandmother, Charlotte, would be proud of you. I am proud of you. Trust yourself. Trust the path that brought you here. And remember that the greatest inheritances aren't what we receive, but the responsibility to do right by them. With love always, your grandfather. P.S. The missing journal pages are in the archive room, hidden in the spine of the old ledger book. They'll explain everything Ezekiel never wanted found. You'll know them when you see them. Hal read the letter twice more, then carefully folded it and placed it back in the envelope. Hal spent Sunday in the mine, searching for the archive room his grandfather had mentioned. He found it behind a false wall in the deepest explored chamber, a smaller space, carefully sealed with newer lumber and a modern padlock. The lock opened with bolt cutters from Clarence's store. Inside, the archive room was dry and organized, testament to his grandfather's meticulous nature. Metal filing cabinets lined one wall. Shelves held carefully labeled boxes. And on a small table sat a leather ledger book, its spine thick and reinforced. Hal opened the ledger more of his grandfather's notes, decades of research and documentation. But when he examined the spine closely, he found what he was looking for. 3 pages, folded small and tucked into a hidden pocket in the binding. Ezekiel's missing journal entries. The pages were fragile, the ink faded but legible. Hal read them carefully, his flashlight beamed steady on the old paper. August 12, 1899. Met today with an elder of the Ute people. He knew I was here, knew about my mining. Expected anger or threats. Instead, he showed me kindness. Said his people had used these caves for generations, long before my kind came seeking metal in the ground. He took me deeper into the mountains, showed me chambers I hadn't discovered. Sacred spaces. Places where his ancestors performed ceremonies, left offerings, sought spiritual guidance. I felt ashamed, standing there with my pickaxe and my greed. August 18th, 1899. The elder returned. His name is Dakota, though he says I may call him friend. He doesn't condemn my mining. Says the earth gives what it gives, and men will take what they take. But he asked me to make a promise, that if I profit from this mountain silver, I will protect what his people left behind. Return it to them someday, when the time is right. I gave my word. It's the least I can do. August 25th, 1899. Dakota brought me gifts, food, a woven blanket, friendship. We sat at the cave entrance, and he told me stories of his people's history with this mountain. How they came here to mark important life transitions. How young men would descend into the darkness and emerge transformed. I understand now why I feel changed by this place. It's not just the silver. It's the weight of all the lives that touched these stones before mine. The entries continued, describing Ezekiel's growing guilt and his determination to honor his promise. The final entry was dated September 1st, 1899. I've hidden the artifacts in the deepest chamber, behind a wall of stones that appears natural. Dakota approves. He says they'll wait there safely until his people can reclaim them. He says the mountain is patient. I've also hidden my best ore samples. If dangerous men come, they'll find enough in the obvious places to satisfy them. But the real treasure, both the silver and the sacred objects, will remain safe. If I die here, let these pages testify. I broke no laws and harmed no one. And I kept my promise to a friend. Hal carefully refolded the pages and placed them in his jacket pocket. Then he examined the filing cabinets. Inside were decades of his grandfather's documentation, photographs of artifacts, correspondence with historians and anthropologists, research into Ute cultural practices, and most importantly, a draft agreement. The document was professionally prepared, detailed, and specific. It outlined the division of the property ceremonial chambers and all artifacts to the Ute Mountain Ute tribe, mineral rights to the Brenner family, with a revenue-sharing arrangement that allocated 10% of any mining proceeds to tribal cultural preservation programs. At the bottom, 2 signature lines. One said, Hal Brenner, Sr., property owner. The other said, Tribal Council Chairman, Ute Mountain Ute Tribe. Both lines were blank. Hal photographed everything, then sat in the archive room thinking. His grandfather had done the hard work, the research, the negotiations, the ethical framework. All that remained was to honor it. But first, he needed to secure his legal position. His siblings' lawsuit would be filed tomorrow. He needed to act quickly. Monday morning, Hal met with Graham Whitfield in the attorney's modest Copperfield office. Graham was in his early 60s, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent his career in small-town practice. But his eyes were sharp, and he listened carefully as Hal explained everything. Your siblings are claiming undue influence and diminished capacity? Graham asked. That's what they threatened. On what grounds? They don't have grounds. They're manufacturing them. Graham nodded slowly. I've seen it before. Family disputes over inheritance bring out the worst in people. He reviewed the will, the property deed, and Vernon's geological report. Here's what we have in your favor. A properly executed will, medical documentation of your grandfather's competency, and a property that's clearly valuable. That's strong. But your siblings have resources. They can hire expensive lawyers, drag this out, make it costly for you. Graham leaned back in his chair. However, you have something they don't expect, the tribal agreement. Hal showed him the draft document and his grandfather's letter. Graham's expression shifted as he read. This changes everything. You're not just defending an inheritance. You're honoring an agreement that involves indigenous heritage. Federal law protects that. If the tribal council intervenes as an interested party, your siblings will face complications they haven't anticipated. So, what do? First, Contact the tribal council immediately. Get them involved. Second, file a counter motion as soon as your siblings file their suit. We'll argue that this isn't just about family assets. It's about preserving cultural heritage and honoring agreements your grandfather made in good faith. Courts look very favorably on that. And if my siblings discover how much the property is worth, then we emphasize your willingness to return priceless artifacts to their rightful owners. That demonstrates your grandfather's wisdom in choosing you, not them. Graham smiled slightly. Sometimes the best defense is showing that you're exactly the kind of person your grandfather believed you to be. Hal left Graham's office and drove directly to the Ute Mountain Ute tribal offices in Tawauk, a 2-hour drive south. He'd called ahead, and Lawrence Whitehorse, the cultural preservation officer, was expecting him. Lawrence was perhaps 50, with graying hair and a quiet dignity that reminded Hal of his grandfather. They met in a small conference room, and Hal explained everything: the inheritance, the mine, his grandfather's letter, the draft agreement. Lawrence listened without interruption. When Hal finished, Lawrence said simply, "We've been waiting 7 years for someone from your family to honor your grandfather's word. We begun to think it wouldn't happen. I'm here to make it happen," Hal said. "Whatever it takes." Lawrence arranged a meeting with the tribal council for the following afternoon. In the meantime, he drove with Hal back to the mountain property to document the artifacts. The council chairman, a man in his 70s named Franklin Whitecloud, came with them, along with 2 tribal elders. They descended into the mine with the reverence of people entering sacred space. In the deepest chamber, behind the stone wall Ezekiel had described, they found what his grandfather had preserved: pottery fragments, ceremonial objects, tools made from bone and stone, and woven items protected by the dry mountain air. One of the elders spoke in Ute, his voice thick with emotion. Lawrence translated. He says these belong to his ancestors. His grandmother told him stories of this place, but the location had been lost. This is a homecoming. They spent hours documenting everything, the elders handling each item with careful respect. Hal watched, understanding fully now what his grandfather had meant about value beyond price. "Your grandfather came to us 7 years ago," Franklin said, photographing a clay vessel. "He was honest about what he'd found, what his ancestor had promised. We negotiated in good faith. Then he became ill, and we thought perhaps the agreement would die with him." "It won't," Hal said. "I want to honor everything he promised." Franklin studied him carefully. "And your siblings? They won't be happy about giving away what they'll see as valuable property. They're already filing a lawsuit to contest my ownership." "Then we'll intervene," Franklin said firmly. "These artifacts give us legal standing. Federal heritage protections will apply. If your siblings want to fight, they'll find themselves facing not just you, but our entire legal team and federal oversight." Lawrence added, "We've dealt with this before, people trying to exploit indigenous heritage sites for profit. The courts don't look kindly on it. Your grandfather's agreement, your willingness to honor it, that puts you on solid legal ground." That evening, back in Copperfield, Hal received the formal lawsuit notification by email. Patricia had filed on behalf of both siblings, claiming undue influence, questioning their grandfather's mental state in his final months, and demanding the property be divided equally among all 3 grandchildren. Graham reviewed it quickly. "It's weak legally, but they're betting on your inability to fight a long court battle. Standard intimidation tactic. What do? We file our response, and we make it clear that the tribal council is an interested party. That will complicate things significantly for them." Graham began drafting. "We're also going to request an expedited hearing. Get this in front of a judge quickly, before they can build momentum." The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. In the intervening time, Hal continued teaching, saw Annie on weekends, and prepared his case with Graham's help. Vernon provided detailed written testimony about the property's value and his grandfather's obvious competence in managing it. Clarence agreed to testify of his grandfather's mental clarity. Frederick Morrison, the attorney who drafted the will, confirmed everything had been done properly with full medical evaluation. Most importantly, Lawrence and Franklin prepared their own filing a motion to intervene in the case on behalf of the tribal council, citing federal heritage protections and their ongoing negotiations with Harold. Brenner Sr. Kenneth called twice during those 3 weeks. Hal didn't answer. Patricia sent several emails, each more threatening than the last. Hal forwarded them all to Graham. The night before the hearing, Annie asked, "Are you scared, Daddy?" They were having dinner in his apartment spaghetti, her favorite. She twirled pasta on her fork, watching him with those two knowing eyes. "A little," Hal admitted. "Your uncle and aunt have a lot more money than I do. They can afford better lawyers, longer fights. But you're doing the right thing. Sometimes doing the right thing is expensive." "Grandpa knew you'd do it anyway," Annie said. "That's why he picked you." From the mouths of children, Hal thought again. She made it sound so simple, and maybe it was. His grandfather had trusted him. The tribal council was counting on him, and somewhere in the mountain, Ezekiel Thorne's century-old promise waited to be kept. "You're right," Hal said. All said. Grandpa knew. That night, he reread his grandfather's letter one more time. The words that struck him most were near the end. Trust yourself. Trust the path that brought you here. He'd spent so much of the past 2 years doubting himself, questioning his choices, second-guessing his decisions, wondering if he was failing as a father, as a teacher, as a man. The divorce had shaken his confidence in ways he was still discovering. But his grandfather hadn't doubted him, had trusted him with something precious, something that required not just intelligence, but integrity. That trust was worth more than any inheritance. Hal folded the letter carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket. Tomorrow in a courtroom, he would defend not just a property, but a promise. Not just an inheritance, but a way of seeing the world. He thought of Ezekiel descending into darkness over a century ago, making a vow to a Ute elder. He thought of his grandfather, keeping that promise alive for 67 years, waiting for the right moment to pass it forward. And he thought of Annie, who at 9 years old understood instinctively what Kenneth and Patricia had never learned, that some things matter more than their monetary value. 3 generations of promises converged in that mountain. 3 men who understood that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the integrity of our choices and the legacy we leave behind. Tomorrow, in a courtroom, Hal would defend not just an inheritance, but that understanding itself. He was ready. The county courthouse was a modest building, brick and stone, built in an era when civic architecture meant something. Judge Morrison presided, a woman in her mid-60s with steel-gray hair, and an expression that suggested she'd heard every argument and excuse twice. Hal sat with Graham at one table. Kenneth and Patricia sat with their attorney, Stanley Richter, at another. Richter was exactly what Hal had expected: expensive suit, confident posture, the kind of aggressive competence that came from winning corporate battles. Also present, Lawrence Whitehorse and Franklin Whitecloud, representing the tribal council's interest. Judge Morrison reviewed the case file. "This is a will contest. Mr. Richter, you're claiming the deceased lacked mental capacity and that your client's brother exercised undue influence. That's a high bar. Proceed." Richter stood smoothly. "Your Honor, the distribution in this will is so irrational as to suggest impaired judgment. Mr. Brenner received property his siblings believed worthless, while they received valuable assets. This suggests the deceased was confused about what he was distributing. Or, Judge Morrison said dryly, it suggests he knew exactly what he was doing and had reasons you're not aware of. But continue." Richter called Patricia first. She took the stand with professional composure, testifying about their grandfather's supposed confusion in his final month's forgotten names. Repeated stories, moments of seeming disorientation. Graham's cross-examination was gentle but effective. "Miss Hartley, when did you last visit your grandfather before his death?" Patricia hesitated. "Approximately 8 months prior." 8 months. "And how often did you visit in the year before that?" "Perhaps twice." "So in his final 2 years, you visited 3 times total?" "I have a demanding career. I'm sure you do. But based on 3 visits over 2 years, you're claiming expertise about his mental state." Patricia's jaw tightened. "I spoke with him by phone regularly." "How regularly?" Another hesitation. "Monthly. Sometimes less." "And during these monthly calls, did he ever express confusion about his estate planning?" "Not directly, but did he ever ask you to visit more often?" "He understood I was busy. Or perhaps he understood you weren't interested unless there was something to inherit." Richter objected. Judge Morrison sustained it, but the point had landed. Kenneth's testimony followed similar lines. He'd visited even less frequently. Claimed their grandfather had been declining. Suggested Hal had manipulated the situation through more frequent contact. Graham's cross-examination was equally effective. "Mr. Brenner, you're a real estate developer. Successful, by all accounts. I do well, yes. Did you ever offer to help your grandfather with his property management? His estate planning?" "He never asked. Did you ask him if he needed help?" Kenneth shifted uncomfortably. "Not specifically. But you're now claiming he was incompetent to manage his own affairs." "I'm saying he made an irrational decision." "Irrational by whose standard?" "Yours?" Graham let that hang. "You inherited property worth $800,000. Your sister inherited $500,000 in antiques. Harold inherited what you called worthless. If your grandfather was so confused, why did he remember to give you and your sister the valuable assets?" Kenneth had no good answer. Graham called the attorney who drafted the will. He testified about multiple meetings with Harold Brenner Sr., about the careful deliberation, about the medical evaluation confirming mental competence. He was absolutely clear about his intentions, the attorney said. He wanted Harold to have the mountain property because, and I quote, "Harold will understand its true worth." Did he explain what he meant by that? Not specifically, but he was emphatic that Harold was the right choice. Judge Morrison reviewed the medical documentation herself, studied it carefully, then looked at Richter. "Your diminished capacity claim is not supported by the evidence. This man had full mental competence when he executed his will." Richter shifted tactics. "Then we argue undue influence. Harold Brenner isolated his grandfather from other family members. By visiting him?" Judge Morrison's tone was skeptical. "Mr. Richter, you're going to have to do better than that." During the lunch break, Patricia approached Hal in the hallway. Kenneth hung back, looking uncomfortable. "Split it 3 ways, Patricia said quietly. "Drop the indigenous agreement, sell the whole property, divide the proceeds. We'll withdraw the lawsuit." Hal looked at his sister, successful, polished, utterly convinced of her righteousness. "No," he said simply. "Why are you being so stubborn? It's just money, Hal." "That's exactly why grandfather didn't leave it to you." Her expression hardened. "You'll regret this." "Maybe, but it'll be my regret, not his." The afternoon session began with Graham presenting their defense. He called Clarence, who testified about Harold Brenner Sr.'s mental sharpness and deliberate planning. "That man was sharp as a tack until the day he died," Clarence said firmly. "He told me specifically he was leaving the mountain property to Harold. Said Harold had the heart to appreciate what it meant." Vernon testified next, explaining the property's geological significance and the sophisticated understanding required to manage it properly. "The deceased documented this site for decades," Vernon said. "The level of detail shows not just competence but expertise. and his grandson Harold has demonstrated the same careful stewardship. Then Graham called Lawrence Whitehorse. Lawrence explained the 7-year negotiation with Harold Brenner Sr., the draft agreement about indigenous artifacts, the cultural significance of the site. Your grandfather approached us voluntarily, Lawrence testified. He wanted to do right by our people. He spent years researching, documenting, preparing an ethical framework for handling what he'd found. This isn't the work of a confused mind. This is the work of a man with deep integrity. Judge Morrison leaned forward. Mr. Whitehorse, you're saying there are indigenous artifacts on this property? Yes, Your Honor. Ceremonial objects, tools, pottery. Items that belong to our people and should be returned under federal heritage protection laws. And Harold Brenner has agreed to this? He has. He's honoring his grandfather's commitment. Stanley Richter looked like he'd been struck. This was information they hadn't anticipated. Judge Morrison turned to Richter. Were you aware of the indigenous heritage component of this property? Richter exchanged glances with Kenneth and Patricia. No, Your Honor. This is the first we're hearing of it. Perhaps if your clients had taken more interest in their grandfather's life, they would have known. The judge's tone was sharp. Continue, Mr. Whitfield. Graham stood. Your Honor, we have one final piece of evidence. With the court's permission, we'd like to present a video recording. What kind of recording? A video testament made by Harold Brenner Sr. 2 weeks before his death, recorded at his attorney's office. Richter objected immediately. This is highly irregular. It's perfectly admissible, Judge Morrison said. I'll allow it. The bailiff set up a screen and projector. The courtroom lights dimmed. And there, filling the screen, was Hal's grandfather. He sat at a conference table, thin but alert, his eyes clear and focused. Seeing him again, hearing his voice, Hal felt tears prick his eyes, but kept his composure. My name is Harold Brenner Sr., his grandfather said into the camera. I am recording this of my own free will, in sound mind and body, to address what I know will be challenges to my will. He paused, gathering his thoughts. My grandchildren Kenneth and Patricia will contest my decisions. I expect this. I've known them all their lives, and I understand how they see the world. They value appearances, status, and wealth above most other considerations. I don't say this with anger. I say it with sadness. I tried to teach them differently, but some lessons can't be forced. In the courtroom, Kenneth stared at the floor. Patricia's face was rigid. My grandson Harold is different. He has integrity, patience, and the ability to see beyond surface value. The mountain property I'm leaving him contains more than most people understand. It has history, responsibility, and purpose. Harold will discover what's there. And when he does, he'll make the right choices. Not the profitable choices. Not the easy choices. The right choices. Hal's grandfather leaned forward slightly, speaking directly to the camera. Kenneth and Patricia would see only dollar signs. Harold will see the story, the heritage, the promise that must be kept. This property isn't just land and minerals. It's a covenant between generations, between Ezekiel Thorne and the Ute people, between me and the grandfather I never met, between me and Harold. He paused again, his voice softening. To my grandchildren who feel slighted, you receive substantial inheritances, more than enough to live comfortably. But to Harold, I'm leaving something more valuable, trust. The trust that he'll honor promises made long before he was born. The trust that he'll choose honor over profit. The trust that he'll teach his daughter, my great-granddaughter Annie, that some things matter more than wealth. His grandfather's eyes seemed to look directly at Hal through the screen. Harold, if you're watching this in a courtroom, it means I was right about your siblings. Don't let them diminish what you're doing. You're not fighting for money. You're fighting for the principle that promises matter, that heritage matters, that some debts transcend generations. Stand firm. I'm proud of you. The video ended. The courtroom was silent. Judge Morrison took her time before speaking. When she did, her voice was measured but firm. "I've heard enough. The will contest is denied. The evidence overwhelmingly shows that Hal Brenner Sr. had full mental capacity and clear intent. Furthermore, the undue influence claim is without merit. Mr. Harold Brenner Jr.'s ownership of the property is confirmed." She looked directly at Kenneth and Patricia. "I'll add that your grandfather's video makes it clear he anticipated your actions and found them predictable. That's not a compliment. This case is dismissed." The gavel fell with finality. Hal exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Graham squeezed his shoulder. Lawrence and Franklin stood, approaching to offer congratulations. Across the courtroom, Stanley Richter gathered his materials quickly. Patricia stood, her face unreadable, and walked out without a word. Kenneth remained seated for a moment, staring at the now blank screen where their grandfather's image had been. Hal approached his brother. "Kenneth." Kenneth looked up, and Hal saw something unexpected in his eyes. Not anger, but something closer to shame. "He really did know us, didn't he?" Kenneth said quietly. "Predicted exactly what we'd do. He knew everyone he loved. But he didn't trust us." Kenneth's voice broke slightly. "He trusted you. He loved you both. But trust and love aren't always the same thing." Kenneth stood slowly. Was there ever a chance for us to be the kind of people he could trust? Hal considered his answer carefully. "There still is, but it starts with understanding that some things matter more than money." Kenneth nodded slowly, processing this. He walked toward the door, then paused. "The artifacts. The indigenous heritage stuff. You're really going to return it all?" "Yes. That's worth millions, probably. I know." Kenneth studied his brother for a long moment. "Maybe he was right about you after all." Then he was gone. Outside the courthouse, Annie was waiting with Denise. Annie had missed school for this. Denise had agreed it was important enough. When Annie saw Hal emerge, she ran to him. "Did you win, Daddy?" Hal lifted her up, suddenly overwhelmed with emotion. "We won. Grandpa won. And now we get to do something really special with what he left us." "The right thing," Annie said confidently. "The right thing," Hal agreed. Vernon appeared, having watched from the gallery. "Congratulations. Your grandfather would be proud." Lawrence and Franklin joined them on the courthouse steps. "Now the real work begins," Franklin said. "Documenting everything, arranging the transfer of artifacts, finalizing the agreement. Are you ready?" Hal looked at the mountains in the distance, at his daughter in his arms, at the people who'd stood with him. "I'm ready," he said. "Let's honor the promises." 6 months passed. Spring came to the mountains, melting the winter snow and revealing new growth. The mountain property had been transformed in that time, not dramatically, but deliberately. Professional engineers had stabilized the mine tunnels. A proper entrance had been installed, secure but accessible. The cabin had been restored enough to be safe, though Hal had kept its essential character intact. Today was the dedication ceremony. A small crowd had gathered, perhaps 50 people. Lawrence Whitehorse and Franklin Whitecloud were there, along with several tribal elders and members of the Ute Mountain Ute community. Vernon had driven up from Denver. Clarence came from Copperfield, along with Mrs. Gaines from the library and Graham Whitfield. Even Frederick Morrison, the attorney who'd read the will, had made the trip. Annie stood beside Hal, wearing a dress she'd picked out herself. She wanted to look nice for what she called Grandpa's special day. The ceremony began with a traditional Ute blessing. An elder spoke in his native language, his words rhythmic and profound, even to those who couldn't understand them. Lawrence translated afterward. "We honor those who came before. We honor those who protected this sacred place. We honor Harold Brenner, who returned what was taken, who chose righteousness over riches. Tribal members placed traditional markers at the mine entrance stones painted with symbols. Feathers tied to branches, offerings of sage and sweetgrass. The mountain was being reclaimed, not as property, but as heritage. The museum director from Denver Natural History Museum spoke next, explaining the significance of the site and the partnership that had been formed. The silver specimens would be displayed in a permanent exhibition, with all proceeds funding tribal cultural preservation programs. This represents a new model for how we handle historical discoveries, she said. Not exploitation, but collaboration. Not taking, but honoring. Thanks to the Brenner family's commitment, this site will educate and inspire for generations. Then came the unveiling of the bronze plaque that would mark the entrance permanently. Hal and Annie pulled away the cloth together, revealing the inscription. This site honors Ezekiel Thorne, 1847 to 1918. Harold Brenner Sr., 1930 to 2021. And the Ute people who first knew this mountain as sacred. Preserved through covenant between generations, protected for generations to come. Hal stepped forward to speak. He'd prepared remarks, but found himself departing from them, speaking from his heart instead. My grandfather taught me that inheritance isn't just about what we receive. It's about what we choose to do with it. This mountain held silver, yes, but more importantly, it held stories, history, and responsibility. He looked at the faces gathered, people who'd helped him, supported him, believed in what he was trying to do. Ezekiel Thorne made a promise to protect this place. My grandfather kept that promise for 67 years. And now, with our partners from the Ute Mountain Ute tribe, we ensure it continues. This is for my daughter Annie, and for all the children who come after. So they know that some promises transcend lifetimes, and that the greatest inheritances aren't measured in dollars, but in the integrity of our choices. Annie stepped forward then, holding something wrapped in cloth. She approached the tribal elders and carefully unwrapped a framed photograph and image of the artifacts before they'd been returned, a visual record of what had been preserved. "This is for you," Annie said shyly. "So you remember what Grandpa and my dad protected." One of the elders accepted the gift, then removed a woven bracelet from his wrist. He knelt to Annie's level and tied it gently around her wrist. He spoke in Ute, and Lawrence translated. "This is a symbol of covenant. Your father honors the old ways. You will carry this forward." Annie looked at the bracelet, then at the elder, her expression solemn. "I promise." After the formal ceremony ended, people mingled, sharing food and conversation. Vernon found Hal standing slightly apart, looking at the mountain. "So what's next for you?" Vernon asked. The museum contract provided enough to buy a house. Nothing fancy, but it's ours. Annie has a college fund now. I'm still teaching, but without the constant financial worry. And the remaining silver deposits? Hal smiled. Sealed for now. Maybe someday Annie will decide what to do with them. But there's no rush. Grandfather waited 40 years. I can wait too. You really did understand what he meant. I'm still learning, but I think I'm on the right path. Clarence approached with news. Town council voted last week. They want to name the new community center after your grandfather. The Harold Brenner Heritage Center for preserving local history. Hal felt warmth spread through his chest. He'd like that. He always believed in community, in preserving what matters. As the afternoon wore on and guests began departing, Hal found himself alone with Annie on the cabin porch. They sat together, watching the sun paint the mountains in shades of gold and orange. "Do you think Grandpa knows what you did?" Annie asked. "I think he knew what I'd do before I did. That's why he trusted me with it." Annie was quiet for a moment. "Uncle Kenneth never came back, did he?" "No, but Aunt Patricia sent a card last month. Just said, 'Congratulations. It's a start. Maybe they'll understand someday. Maybe. Some people need more time than others." Annie leaned against him. "I'm glad you're my dad." Hal pulled her close, overwhelmed by the simple profundity of her words. "I'm glad you're my daughter, and I'm glad we gotta do this together." They watched the stars begin to emerge, one by one, in the darkening sky. His grandfather had taught him constellations on this mountain, pointing out patterns and telling the stories behind their names. Now Hal did the same for Annie, passing forward what had been passed to him. Later, inside the cabin, Hal opened his grandfather's journal to a blank page near the back. He'd been adding his own entries, creating a record for whoever might come after. "Tonight," he wrote, "we honored your promise today. The mountain is protected, the artifacts returned, the story preserved. Annie knows her heritage now. She understands that wealth isn't what you hoard, but what you give forward. The inheritance you left wasn't silver. It was wisdom. And I'm passing it on, just as you passed it to me, just as Ezekiel passed it to you through the generations. Thank you for believing I'd understand. Thank you for waiting until I was ready. Time revealed all truths, just like you promised. With love and gratitude, Harold." He set down the pen and looked at his grandfather's pocket watch, which now sat on the cabin's mantel. It still kept perfect time, still ticked with steady reliability, still bore the inscription that had guided him through everything. Time reveals all truths. Hal picked up the watch, felt its familiar weight, and understood finally what his grandfather had meant. Not that time would reveal secrets, though it had done that, but that time would reveal character. That faced with choices between profit and principle, between wealth and integrity, between taking and honoring, people would show who they truly were. His grandfather had trusted that Hal's character would guide him to the right choices, and in the end, that trust had been the greatest gift of all. Outside, the mountain stood silent under starlight, keeping its promises as it had for millennia. 3 men had protected its secrets across 3 generations. And in doing so, they'd proved that the greatest treasures aren't found in the ground, but in the choices we make about what to do when we find them. Annie called from the doorway. "Daddy, can we sleep here tonight? In Grandpa's cabin?" Hal smiled. "I think that's a perfect idea." They spread sleeping bags on the cabin floor, and Hal told Annie stories his grandfather had told him about miners and mountains, about promises and heritage, about the long chain of choices that connects past to future. As Annie drifted to sleep, Hal lay awake for a while longer, listening to the mountain's silence. He thought about Kenneth and Patricia, about the lessons they'd yet to learn. He thought about Ezekiel Thorne, making promises in darkness a century ago. He thought about his grandfather, keeping those promises alive through decades of quiet dedication. And he thought about himself, a divorced single father, a struggling teacher, someone who'd felt like a failure not so long ago, and realized that his grandfather had seen something in him that he hadn't seen in himself. The capacity not just to receive an inheritance, but to honor it. Not just to accept trust, but to prove worthy of it. The mountain had revealed its truth to him, just as it had to Ezekiel, just as it had to his grandfather. And that truth was simple. Some legacies aren't about what we're given, but about who we choose to become when tested by the weight of responsibility. In the darkness, with his daughter sleeping peacefully beside him and generations of promises kept and continued, Hal finally understood the full measure of his inheritance. It wasn't the silver. It wasn't even the land. It was the knowledge that he'd been trusted with something precious and had proven worthy of that trust. That, he realized, was the inheritance that truly mattered. And it was one he would carry forward, as his grandfather had carried it, as Ezekiel had carried it, until the time came to pass it to the next generation. The mountain kept its promises, and so would he.